This DVD continues from a previous volume. If you haven't watched the previous volumes, it's highly recommended that you do so first. On the next 2 volumes, we'll be working with a moving camera. In order to practice these techniques in a low-pressure environment, it's strongly suggested that you have your own dolly and crane. We've put together a page of links for where you can purchase inexpensive dollies and cranes. For more information, go to www.hollywoodcamerawork.us/resources.html. For the moving camera work on the next volumes, we'll use this all-purpose rig to illustrate tracking shots, boom shots, and crane shots. Naturally, camera support equipment comes in all shapes and sizes, so let's look at how this rig approximates each type of support. The main difference is really just the length of the boom. Dollies don't have a boom, but instead a hydraulic arm that can raise or lower the camera slightly during takes, so we'll illustrate this with a very short boom. The hydraulic arm itself can be positioned higher or lower, but only between takes and is a more permanent setting. To show panning, the camera's angle of view sweeps left and right. To illustrate tilting, the angle of view moves up and down, showing the vertical middle of the shot. And to show tracking, we push the base of the dolly. A boom or a jib is longer, allowing for vertical movement of 10 to 15 feet, still mounted on track. Sometimes the camera operator is seated on a platform at the end of the crane, but more commonly the camera pan and tilt are remotely controlled, which is how we'll show it. Cranes come in any length, and using the same rig, we'll simply show it as a longer boom. Although many cranes are technically mounted on a dolly, it's often impractical and sometimes dangerous to move the base of the crane during a shot, so we'll mainly use the track to fine-tune the crane's position before a shot. We're working exclusively with straight track. Circular track is more for commercial or music video type shots and doesn't have a lot of uses for narrative camera work. A crab dolly doesn't run on track, but is positioned directly on the studio floor and can change direction at a moment's notice. We won't work with crab dollying directly, but everything we're doing with straight track applies equally well to crab dollying, with the advantage that we can combine very different camera moves and directions into single takes. On the next 2 volumes, we want to create a large vocabulary of camera moves from which to pick and choose when staging scenes. But let's first look at some very general approaches to blocking. Storyboarding is a very common way to plan scenes, and they can be a great tool for working out complex sequences that involve quick cuts and difficult action. If we're doing visual effects, stunts, or need to sell a concept, they're a complete necessity. But contrary to popular belief, storyboarding is very counterproductive as a shot planning tool for the vast majority of scenes because they force us to think sequentially and do very incohesive camera work. So let's storyboard a quick scene to look at this. First, we'll start on a phone. We cut to a man as he's waiting for it to ring. We cut to reveal another man who's also in the scene. We do a shot of the man by the phone from another angle as they have some dialogue. And a close-up of the other man. Then we go to a master out here. We do a slow push as they both walk to the middle of the room. We have a 2-shot in here. Then a reverse on the first man, and a reverse on the second. Back in the 2-shot, they turn, and we cut to a camera here, revealing the woman as she enters. We cut close as they have some dialogue. We go back in the master as she walks closer. Then we have a 3-shot here. Then we go to a close-up on the woman. She then turns and leaves, and we cut to the reverse 3-shot again. We go to the 2-shot from before. Then the red man walks back to the table, and we go to a close-up on the other man. We end on this shot of the man by the table waiting for the phone to ring. We managed to use a whopping 15 cameras for this short scene. The way we planned this scene is obviously uneconomical, but the point is this. We start on the phone. Then cut to the low-angle shot. We cut to reveal the blue man. Then we cut close on the blue man. And cut to an internal reverse on the red man. Already we've used 5 cameras. As the scene moves forwards, every time something new happens, we add another camera, which causes the number of cameras to skyrocket. Storyboarding is inherently sequential. As soon as we've used a camera to get a small chunk, we abandon that camera and move on to the next shot on the list. This makes every shot separate, so the scene becomes very cutty and doesn't stick together as well. It also means that we're resetting camera and lights constantly, which can take a lot of time. And the actors only get to do fragments of a few lines, which hurts their performances. With this many cameras, it becomes extremely hard to keep track of the blocking, and we're very likely to create editing problems inadvertently because we have no awareness of where the line is. But on a more creative level, storyboarding excludes a great many camera moves and techniques because they're impossible to plan and draw this way. Storyboards also don't translate well to film, and anything shot this way usually comes out less exciting than the storyboard itself. So storyboarding is really not a very good way to plan or write down camera work. On Volume 5, we'll create a way to write down camera work much the same as notation is used to write down music. For now, let's look at a different approach to staging scenes that uses far fewer cameras and has none of the drawbacks we just looked at. A better approach to blocking is to think in parallel. Here our goal is instead to use far fewer cameras that work together and have a greater role. Planning cameras to work in parallel, they all depend on each other, and if one camera fails, the scene potentially falls apart. But since we're shooting fewer cameras, we have more time to get them right. The example we'll do here is theoretical and not how we'd normally block a scene, but it proves an important point. So let's redo the previous scene this way using only 3 cameras, starting with the first camera. We'll try to tell the same story, so let's start on the phone and then pull back and reframe to reveal the blue man. Let's create a second camera, a close-up on the blue man, and put it on a track so we can track with him later. We can now cut the first dialogue between these 2 cameras. The reason we're seeing 2 tracks is that we're planning the scene as if it's a multi-camera shoot, but we'll naturally shoot them one at a time. The characters walk out into the middle of the room, and we'll have them end like this. Then have the first camera slowly catch up, ending in and over the shoulder. Meanwhile, we'll have the close camera on the blue man pull into a reverse we can use in the upcoming 3 shot. The shot widens, and as they talk in the middle of the room, we have the option of cutting to this camera if we need some reverse coverage. The woman now enters. We pan this camera, and we lose the red man for a moment. Here we add a close-up on the woman and cut to it. Back in the first camera, the red man steps forwards, and we move the dolly a little to the side, so the shot is now in over the shoulder between him and the woman. As the woman walks into the scene, a couple of things happen at the same time. Starting in this camera, we pull to a mark over here that creates a perfect framing for a 3-shot. Meanwhile, this camera pulls with a woman into the scene, remaining a close-up. This camera does nothing except reframe to become a reverse 3-shot at the end of her walk. We can now cut the dialogue between them using all 3 cameras. As the woman leaves, this camera is out, and we'll reuse the track for this camera to do a slow push on the men. They turn to each other and talk. The red man walks back to the phone, and the camera ends in and over the shoulder. Meanwhile, this camera has repositioned off camera, so we can cut the ending dialogue between these 2 cameras. The moral of thinking in parallel is to get out of the habit of thinking in separate shots, but instead become constantly aware of what all cameras are doing simultaneously. This creates tight and cohesive camera work where we get much more mileage from each camera. Here we went out of our way to use only 3 cameras, so the camera work wasn't necessarily creative. And in reality, we won't have this much choreography for each camera, but instead have more cameras that only cover a section of the scene. But the point is that thinking in parallel creates very organic scenes that cut well almost no matter what we do, are very easy to manage, and allow the actors to do longer takes. This type of camera work is fairly easy to plan and execute, but the question is, how would we even begin to storyboard it? Thinking in keyframes is a deceptively simple way to create powerful and tight camera work. Working in keyframes is so effective that many of the techniques we're using on the next 4 volumes involve keyframes in one way or another. Simply put, the goal is to plan camera moves as a series of framings that each are perfect by themselves, and then use tracking, panning, or craning to connect them. A keyframe is really just a stop, except it's also a camera stop and can be any type of shot we've already looked at. The point is that a keyframe is a well-framed shot that would work locked as well. Here we'll start with a single shot on the man and call it a keyframe. From the camera, we frame the shot to get a bit of the tree in the foreground. Next, we'll have the man walk over here and mark another keyframe, which we framed as an over-the-shoulder. For the next keyframe, the man walks to the end of the table, and we're placing the camera down here with the red woman in the foreground. So when we track from the second keyframe to the third, the woman will be revealed at the end of the move in a perfect framing. For a fourth keyframe, the man moves over to the blue woman, which is a very deliberate over-the-shoulder 3-shot. For the last keyframe, we'll have the blue woman step forwards and place the keyframe here, so the end result will be a push into this keyframe. Working in keyframes, we always arrive somewhere deliberate, which brings an enormous feeling of purpose and resolve to the blocking. As we track from the first to the second keyframe, we arrive in an over-the-shoulder. As we move to the third keyframe, we're resetting both the dolly, the camera pan tilt, and the boom height, creating this framing. Anytime we arrive in a keyframe, it comes across as a lucky coincidence. Here we're pulling back as the man walks forwards, conveniently arriving in this 3-shot. This is the opposite of how most of us have learned to think of camera moves because we're used to focusing on the moves themselves. Working in keyframes, we're much more interested in where we're coming from and going to, and the moves come about as a natural consequence of moving between keyframes. Moreover, thinking in keyframes integrates camera moves seamlessly into the scene and gives us many more reasons to do tracking shots than if we only use moves to achieve a particular effect. So in blocking a scene, one of the first things we should do after deciding on the basic character movement is find the keyframes we know we'll want to be in. Here the red man will walk from dialogue with the extra over to this dialogue. So a couple of useful keyframes could be to start a move in an over-the-shoulder with the red woman in the background and end it with the man as part of an A shape. Each of these would work as a lock shot, but connecting them with a track, the resulting camera move is a completely integrated part of the scene. Blocking in keyframes is an extremely easy way to create effective camera work because all we have to do is find good framings within the scene and then find ways to connect them. This also means that how we connect the keyframes is secondary, whether with a pan, track, or crane, but of course our choice of keyframes reflects how we intend to connect them. Here we'll do roughly the same move with a pan, starting with a keyframe here, and a keyframe here with the camera in the same spot. So we're starting in an over-the-shoulder on the other side as before, and pan with a red man as he walks, again ending with him as part of an A shape. Keyframes are an integral part of parallel staging because the script for each camera essentially is to go between a series of keyframes. Starting with the first camera, we're walking with a woman into an over-the-shoulder keyframe. The woman walks away from the man, and we nudge a little back on the same track to maintain the over-the-shoulder, and forwards again as she walks back to the man. We're setting up the other camera to be a reverse, so as the woman walks to the over-the-shoulder, this camera starts out on the wrong side of the line, until she arrives. As she walks away from the man, we pull into a shot here with her in the foreground, which should create a nice framing, and back again into the over-the-shoulder. All we've done is find the keyframes we want represented and connected them on tracks. The resulting choreography for each camera is very simple and directable. Both cameras are useful throughout the scene, so even though we only have 2 cameras, the coverage is rich and feels like much more. The first example we did in this chapter had 5 keyframes per camera, but only having a couple per camera like this is more normal, and probably the quickest way to get a solid handle on a scene. In this chapter, we'll elaborate on keyframes by looking a little more at ending keyframes. It's very normal to start a camera move without a clear plan for where we want to end up, and it's an unfortunate habit many of us have developed. In this scene, we're in a bar, and the two women are having a conversation. After a while, the red woman spots someone she knows, and they have a conversation. Since we're imagining some sort of push in the beginning, let's go ahead and push in slowly as the women talk. This gets the dialogue covered. But where we end up is not very useful for the next dialogue, so for that we'll add 2 internal reverses. The tracking camera is now useless for the rest of the scene. Moves without a destination usually become very detached shots that don't blend well into the scene. After the move, we simply abandon the shot and cut to another camera. So let's give purpose to the move by planning it backwards. We'll start knowing that the red woman and the man will eventually have dialogue and lay the track so that we end up as one of the internal reverses. As the women have their dialogue, we slowly push in on the scene. To the audience, we're just doing a push, but we're in fact going somewhere. As the red woman turns to talk to the man, the dolly is now an internal reverse. One more locked camera covers the man. So we've not only saved a camera, the blocking is much more deliberate and intentional. This sounds extremely simple, and it is, but very few people do it. Thinking backwards is a useful habit to develop because we always elegantly arrive where we need to be. When we think forwards, we're usually doing it because we want to experience what the audience is experiencing, which is the thrill of discovery. But while it's fine for the audience to not know what's coming up, it's essential that we do, or we're directing blindfolded. In this scene, we're tracking behind some trees as the characters enter. When they stop, we really can't do any more with this camera, so we'll abandon it. To cover their dialogue, we add 2 reverses. At the end of the scene, the man will leave, and we suddenly realize that we need to do a push on the woman, so we move the camera over on the track and push as he leaves. Both tracking cameras are detached from the scene. We could block this much smarter by planning it backwards. Looking first at the cut, the characters enter and we track with them. We end in an over the shoulder and cut some dialogue. When the man leaves, we push in on the woman, ending in a close shot. In this version, everything we did was a consequence of where we were going. We first decided on 2 major keyframes and laid a track that could do both. With this track angle, we got easily into the first keyframe and into the second, and we used half the number of cameras. Here, we're panning with the man as he walks from the extras towards someone he's talking to, ending in a well-framed over the shoulder. We started by creating the ending keyframe. Then we bring the man back to the extras and pan with him into the over the shoulder. We know the ending position, but the audience doesn't, so from within the scene, it seems as if we arrive in a good framing by luck. When we're doing deep staging, thinking backwards is essential because the frame is so meticulously put together. If we pan with the man, we arrive in this framing. We would have to be extremely lucky to arrive here without planning it. Instead, we treat the ending position as our fix and frame it carefully. In the man's prior position, the camera position is whatever it will be because of the ending. When we pan, the framing is already set up. Let's stage a very simple scene to get in the habit of planning shots and keyframes and creating cameras that work together. We'll reblock the father-daughter scene that we worked with on Volume 2. In the blocking we did, the only fixes we had were Amy entering the scene at the beginning and leaving at the end. We'll place John behind a desk as Amy enters. Then he stands up. Soon after, he walks over here. He turns, and finally we'll have him walk out into the middle of the room to Amy, after which she leaves. That creates 4 basic marks. Let's find some good keyframes. We'll first work on creating a camera that's behind John looking out on Amy. On John's first mark, we could be down here. When he stands up, we could have this camera boom up with him, which is then our second keyframe. The third keyframe would be as he's walked away from the table. These keyframes could easily be combined into one jib on a track. We'll start low and then boom up for the second keyframe. As he walks to his third keyframe, we track with him. Since we already have the track laid, let's also track into the first keyframe. We'll create a keyframe number 0 where we start by the phone and track left with Amy to reveal John. Let's look at the take. We track into an over-the-shoulder as Amy enters, revealing John. We boom up as he gets up, and we track with him to his next mark while we try to keep Amy in the frame in case she has lines. When John turns and walks out into the middle of the room, this camera expires. So let's create another camera to cover him after the turn. We'll create 2 keyframes, one where he is now, and one where he's walked over to Amy. These keyframes easily combine into one track. Since we're shooting the cameras one at a time, we'll either cheat the setup to the left or move the table out of the way. Lastly, since we're already on a track, let's do a push on John at the end as Amy leaves. Let's look at the take. John is facing away. He turns. We pull with him, revealing Amy and ending in an over-the-shoulder. At the end, as Amy leaves, we reuse the track to push in on him. Finally, we'll put in a close-up on Amy. The reason we're doing that camera last is that it needs to accommodate the other cameras. If we look at the lines we've created, our first line goes from Amy to John by the table, and our second line goes between them when John is out in the room. So to make it easy for ourselves, let's put her close-up between these 2 lines. In the beginning, we'll frame her to the right because John is to the left of us. That puts this shot a little far away from the eye line, but for the sake of economy, that'll be good enough. As John moves out into the room, we'll reframe during the shot because John is now to the right. Additionally, we'll place this camera so that it's a matching reverse for the camera that pulls with John over to Amy. We're then able to cut the remaining dialogue between these 2 mirrored cameras. Let's view the cut.
The school called. They said you never came in.
What a bunch of liars. My ankle got twisted in gym and I was late for 1 class.
You seem to be doing fine now.
Did Mrs. Tweed call? How can you believe her over your own daughter?
You used to be such a nice little girl. I could always believe anything you told me. Now I don't know what to think. Amy, are you even paying attention?
Yeah, sure.
Why don't you feel you can tell me what's going on? I'm sure I can understand it, whatever it is.
Okay, Dad.
Come on, treasure, you can tell me.
I'm not your treasure, okay? I'm not your gem. I'm not your jewel, all right? And you don't understand anything, Dad.
For the next number of hours, we want to develop a comprehensive language of camera moves. Starting with panning, we'll assume that simple pan moves like panning with a character need no explanation. This is useful for single cameras that stand on their own, but to make pans a more integrated part of a scene, we need them to be part of the coverage structure. Thinking again in keyframes, it's useful to remember that a keyframe is essentially a stop that includes a stop for the camera. If all camera pans start or end in a keyframe, the pan is a natural part of the scene. So if we plan a regular scene out of stops, the woman starts here, then walks over here, and we'll add 2 reverses. Then she walks over here, and we'll add another pair of reverses. But instead of having the characters simply walk in and out of their respective shots, we'll pan with them into them. So starting in the camera that will become the over-the-shoulder on the man, we pan with a woman. into this keyframe that seems to just come conveniently out of nowhere. After cutting to the reverse, we cut to this camera, which will become the new over-the-shoulder on the man. She walks, and we pan, again ending in a perfect keyframe. So instead of planning actual pan moves, we're more concerned with setting up stops or keyframes, and the moves come about as a natural byproduct of that. But beyond panning into stops, it's useful to plan character movement as going between keyframes. Here we'll go between an over-the-shoulder and a master, so it's essentially a transforming camera, except we're panning to help make it happen. As she walks back, we transform back into an over-the-shoulder. Here we're in a close-up on the woman. She turns and we're in a perfect over-the-shoulder. If we're already in an over-the-shoulder and we want to single out the woman, we can use the same move in reverse. We're not just panning into stops. The shots are designed as distinct keyframes we're connecting with a pan. This way of blocking can extend pretty far, and it ensures that the framing is always good, which creates a feeling of being on track. Here we're starting with a keyframe on the woman and the red man, set up as a right-angle master. When she walks over to the blue man, we've carefully set up both character and camera stops to become an over-the-shoulder. So starting in the right-angle master, we pan into an over-the-shoulder, which seems to arise out of nowhere. And using this camera as a sort of backbone for the scene, in the second keyframe, all we have to do is add a matching reverse to complete the coverage. As the scene continues, she walks back into the master. Blocking like this starts with locking in one of the keyframes. Here we've designed the first keyframe to be symmetrical around the door. With this as our fix, we then move her over to what will become the second keyframe and move the characters around until the framing is good. If instead this keyframe is our fix, we move her over by the man and adjust them both to find the framing. This is extremely easy to do and gives immediate structure to the blocking. Another more two-dimensional way to pan from keyframe to keyframe is a carryover from animation, where it's a central blocking method. Here we're using a fairly long lens, and as the woman moves between the other characters, each camera and character stop is set up as a distinct keyframe. As she stops on the other side of the first character, the shot is framed well enough that it could work locked. She walks to the next character, again a keyframe, and to the other side. And out here into an over-the-shoulder. Since we're shooting with a long lens, the character positions are mainly designed for the horizontal positions in the frame, and we've kept just enough space between them that we're able to create individual keyframes. Blocking in keyframes like this is not a big technique, which is why it's so easy to overlook. So to quickly see what kind of structure we get from planning blocking as panning between keyframes, let's put together a small scene. We'll start in master dialogue between the woman and the red man. Then the woman walks out here and we transform the shot into an over-the-shoulder. With the previous keyframe as our fix, we'll adjust her position to create an over-the-shoulder and add a reverse for dialogue. To keep the scene moving, let's have them meet in the middle, again a master. The woman leaves, and we pan with her over to another keyframe by the blue man. The blue man walks over to the red man, ending in an over-the-shoulder. Our only variable here is the blue man's mark, so we've tweaked his position accordingly. Let's also add another reverse. Nothing makes the effectiveness of panning from keyframe to keyframe more vivid than when each keyframe is a deep staging shot. In the first keyframe, we have the woman in the foreground and the red man having a conversation in the background. The red man spots her and walks over. In the meanwhile, we just seem to be panning, until we again arrive in a carefully composed frame. Reframing is a very subtle move that is a habit of most camera operators, and we usually don't need to worry about it. The purpose of reframing is primarily to maintain a good framing as characters step in and out of or move within a shot. But the move also has some implications for how we may want to block shots, so let's still look at it. Starting with adding or removing characters from a shot, as the man enters, we reframe to include him. When he leaves, we reframe for the woman. The move is the same regardless of the number of characters. Here we're going from 2 characters to 3. As the blue man leaves, we again refrain for 2. Treating the move as going between 2 keyframes, each extreme is framed perfectly for the number of characters. We then simply go between them. When characters move to and from the camera, we need to reframe vertically. Here the man walks closer, and to stay on him, we let the woman slide down in the frame. To focus on the woman, we reframe for her. To focus on the man again, we reframe for him. As he walks back, we again reframe vertically to maintain a good framing. Typically, we make the best framing for the character who's the current focus of the scene. In this over-the-shoulder, the shot is balanced for the man, with the woman being cropped by the frame. But if she turns to think, we balance the frame for her, leaving the man to be cropped. When she turns back, we again reframe for the man. But reframing starts to become a blocking decision when we use it to move the empty space to the other side of a character during a line cross. In this shot, the line is to the right, so we're placing the empty space on that side. As the man moves to the other side, we're repositioning the character in the frame to get the space on the better side. By having reframing be a known possibility when blocking, it's very easy to create cameras that will work for both sides of the line simply by reframing. Regardless of whether or not we're dealing with a line, keeping the space in front of the character creates the most comfortable shot. So if a character turns, we'll naturally move the space over on the other side. How this again becomes a blocking decision is that reframing causes a reveal of a new part of the set, which can be used to bring in characters. So if we redo the last shot, as the men leave, we reframe to keep the space in front of her. Already in that space is a character coming towards her for the next dialogue. Another use for reframing is to flip the staging to add movement to an otherwise static scene. Here we're in a locked over the shoulder. But to add movement just for the sake of it, we'll have the red man walk over here. We're simply flipping the staging. And when he walks back, we flip it back again. To do the same using the woman, we'll start here and set the mark so that when she walks, we again become an over the shoulder, mirroring the first keyframe. And when she walks back to her first mark, we're again in an over the shoulder. Reframing like this is an extremely easy way to add movement to a static scene, and the simple act of talking may be all the motivation we need. Regrouping is similar to reframing. Where grouping was about choosing which characters are together in a shot, with regrouping we changed this during a shot. In this example, we have 3 characters in an eye shape, and we've grouped 2 of them together. As the middle character turns her attention, we use her as a pivot and regroup the shot for the 2 other characters. When she turns back, we regroup again. This is also a very natural and easy move to do when a character leaves. As the man walks out, we regroup for the other dialogue. As soon as we're covering a scene in tighter shots, regrouping is an easy way to select the part of the scene we're interested in at a particular time. Here we're using regrouping to go between 2 over the shoulders as the man shifts his attention from woman to woman. We start in reverse dialogue between the man and the blue woman. In the regrouping camera, we use the man as both a pivot and a hinge to get to the other dialogue. After cutting to the reverse, we regroup back to the first dialogue. Using pan to control the order information is presented in is a natural extension of open and closed framings. The point again is that as soon as we've revealed the entire scene, we have nothing new to add. But if we instead design scenes to generally move from open framings towards closed ones, we're continuously able to add information. This makes the scene stay interesting for much longer, and the vast majority of scenes can and often should be open this way. Where before we were mainly using this to control the cutting order, for instance from this shot to this shot, using pan to start on, reveal, and end on gives much more longevity to the process of revealing information. As we scan across the objects on the floor, we have questions about what we're seeing, so we're drawn in. As we arrive by a man's feet, we still have questions about who we're seeing. As we tilt up, we finally get some answers. Doing pan versions of openings we could just as easily have done with cutting. Here we start the scene on hands that are tapping nervously on the table. We tilt up, revealing a distraught main character. Even if we know who's listening to the tape recorder, we don't know what condition he's in before we tilt up, or who he's with before we pan to the right. But instead of being a sudden reveal as with cutting, the pan makes the reveal very gradual and fluid. Anytime we're opening a scene, it's a great idea to look for something to start on and then pan into the main scene. Here we'll start on a clock on the wall and then tilt into the main keyframe where the characters are waiting impatiently. Here we start on a store sign and tilt down as the man arrives, ending on him as he stops. These moves don't even need to be planned into the blocking because they're so easy to discover on the set. Another very effective thing to do is start with a central character off camera. As we pan across the listening characters, we hear the red man talking and recognize his voice. But it's visually much more interesting to start away from him and finally reveal him. Here the woman is talking with someone off camera. At some point she steps forwards, causing the man to be revealed. An elegant technique is to start on the effect of the character being in the scene instead of the character herself. Here we're starting on a washing bowl with a woman's reflection scattered in the water. Even if we know who she is, there's plenty we don't know about her. It's this desire to know something that keeps us watching any film, which is why withholding information like this works, even if what we have to reveal isn't super important. Another type of effect to start on is a shadow. Here we're starting on the floor as a woman's shadow moves into the shot. Again, we're not trying to create a big mystery, we're just making it a little more interesting. So far, we've been using reveals to open the scene, but reveals can just as easily be placed at the end of the scene, which makes the scene end in a question we'll keep watching to get answered. Here we pan with a man as he walks into the store, revealing the woman up front. This move can have two meanings. If he knows she's there, the move functions as a reaction shot or a thinking shot. If he doesn't know about her, her reveal is unsettling, the feeling of which spills over into the next scene. On a much more mundane level, we can use this to provide some information necessary later. Here we pick up on a pan with the red man. He stops for a moment, then walks into the store. We tilt up, ending by showing where he's going. To go to extremes, we could put together a scene as a series of reveals. A car drives in. We tilt down on the wheel to reveal mud splashed all over the car. Meanwhile, the doors slam off camera. We tilt up to reveal the blue man. We pan to reveal the red man as he steps forwards. He walks out of the scene and we re-reveal the blue man. He leaves and we tilt down, revealing a bullet hole in the windshield. Here we withheld each bit of information until the last minute. Transitions have many meanings. In editing, it's a fade or a wipe between shots. In acting, it's the moments or beats in a scene where the mood changes. But to add another meaning, in blocking, it's the times where we go from one distinct thing to another, for instance here, as we dolly over to bring in another character. Calling this a transition is not an official term, at least not yet, but the reason we need to look at it as separate from everything else is that these moves need to go in as some of the first shots when planning a scene. The purpose of this chapter is mainly to introduce the concept, because we'll be returning to it at random during the next 2 volumes. But to quickly look at a couple of examples, the shot in the last chapter where the woman steps forwards revealing the man is a transition. In this example, we're with a man by a control panel. In a moment, another man will walk through the door in the background. When he does, we've bridged 2 bits of action into one seamless shot. Here the script calls for the woman to have a conversation with the blue man, after which the red man makes some comments. This can be an excellent transition. If we don't already know that the red man is in the scene, doing a reveal on his first line is a smooth way to bring him in. Even if we already know he's there, it's still an elegant way to connect her line with his line. So a transition is very often one character introducing another by means of their movement, but it's really any move that absolutely must be in one particular place at a particular time in the scene. Instead of doing the scene and discovering the move, we'll lay in the move as the very first thing and then find something to use that camera for before and after. Here the man is talking with the woman, and the move we have in mind tracks him as he walks to the other chair to continue the conversation. With a move this specific, we need to put that in first. In both the first and second keyframe, the camera isn't over the shoulder, so let's instead build the scene around it and add matching reverses for each stop. We then cut the dialogue between the first two reverses, one of which is on the track. The man walks. We track with him. And as he sits down, we're still in over the shoulder, so we'll cut the remaining dialogue between this and the matching reverse. There are infinitely many more moves that function as transitions, and when they're mentioned, the key is that these are moves that need to go in first. In this chapter, we'll look at 3 nearly identical pan moves that all in one way or another are extensions of starting on and revealing. The first is searching. A simple pan move would be to pan across a group of people, as here where the characters are witnessing an important event. Searching is slightly different in that we have specific targets that we want to include in the move. Here we pan across objects on a table, and the move is choreographed to include the phone. Then the teacup, and finally the gun in the hand. These types of moves are very straightforward to do and are usually created by first deciding on the general move and then laying out the objects on the table in consecutive order. This is great for dialogue too. If we arrange characters by their order in the script, we're able to create a single searching move that happens to pass by each character just in time for their lines. Here the characters have dialogue as numbered, but if we simply pan between them, the camera would have to change direction a lot. So instead we'll decide on the move we want and then simply rearrange the characters to fit with the move. As we pan across the characters, we pass by them for their lines, first the red man, then the blue man, the man in the suit, and finally the woman. In a lot of scenes, it really doesn't matter where we place the characters, so we might as well position them in a way that helps the blocking. A distinction we need to introduce both for now and for later is that panning and tracking are completely separate moves. This means that most pan moves can be done independently at the same time as tracking, which allows us to create some very sophisticated moves that are very easy to execute. So using one technique for panning and another for tracking, we'll keep the same pan, going from the red man to the blue man, over to the man in the suit, and down to the woman. But besides the obvious production value, there's a practical reason to put a search on a track. Unless all characters are facing the same way, we'll be seeing some of them from the back. Here we've already arranged the characters by their order in the script. We then start on the red man, then the blue woman, the red woman, and then the blue man. Putting the search on a track allows us to get access to the characters at the time of their lines. Additionally, we'll arrange the camera to end in and over the shoulder so the camera stays useful after the move. We're now using the track to help us see the characters better. We go smoothly from line to line and end in and over the shoulder. Shifting is a time pan from one subject to another. Here we shift between characters as each have their lines. The man has a line, then the woman, then the other man. This can be an elegant way to connect lines or bits of action. Shifting is usually done in a tight shot because it depends on the subject that we're shifting to being outside the frame. We start on the gun, then shift up to his face. A man is knocked to the ground. We start on him, then shift up to his attacker. Here we have 3 characters talking with each other. As each character has a line, we shift to them and lock on to their walk. Since we're going between a series of open framings, every shift is a reveal which can keep the scene moving. It also gives us a feeling of a single vantage point. However, doing one long shifting shot will ultimately become irritating, so it's best used for a transition. A shift as a transition is easy to do in a short scene because it can be our only coverage. If the entire scene consists of the man saying something, the woman responding with a few lines, and the man making a last comment, we're covered. Otherwise, we need to determine when to do the shifting and which camera to do it with. We have two options, the first of which is to borrow one of the cameras already set up. Assuming we've shot a full take on the woman, we're now shooting the man's angle. At some point, we borrow this camera to shift to her. And back again. The other option is to shoot the shift as a pickup. After we're done shooting a full take on the man, we'll shoot a separate take where all we do is shift to the woman. And back again, which gives us complete editing freedom. If we're in the gun duel, we might borrow this camera to shift down to the gun and up again. Or we can shoot a pickup as a start-on reveal. Shifting can result in very tight blocking when we go from keyframe to keyframe. Here we're doing a start-on reveal from the paper up on the woman, then shift to a keyframe over here. Each of our stops is carefully framed and it gives the action a tight flow. A swish is a fast shift. In this example, the woman is walking down an alley and suddenly realizes that she's under attack. We swish between her and the attackers. Swishes are hectic and are usually reserved for extremely dramatic situations. Here we're in a control room during a disaster. As they grapple with how to shut down a leaking nuclear reactor, we swish between them. The group leader gives an order. We swish over to the operator as he pushes a button. As with a shift, we have to choose between shooting a separate pickup or borrowing a camera for it. As we swish, we're borrowing her camera. The fast speed of a swish makes it hard to use for anything but the most dramatic sequences. Here we're pushing in as two characters realize that they have to catch a certain train to intercept another character. The train leaves at 8:29. Again, swishing can result in very tight blocking when we're going from keyframe to keyframe. In this short sequence, the information they've been waiting for finally comes up. We swish to the operators as they realize it. We swish to the executives as they get the information. They leave and we shift back to the operators. A scene like this requires a steady hand. To prepare the move, we first found an angle that gets us a good view of all three stops. In the second and third keyframes, we've tweaked the characters to get the framing we want. We then swish between the keyframes. An important note about swishes is that the camera's shutter must be slow enough that we get adequate motion blur. Here the motion blur is fine. If the shutter's too fast, the result is strobing. The last thing we'll look at here is the swish cut. A swish cut is using a swish to create a hard cut between two scenes. This is done by swishing out of the first scene, swishing into the second scene, and then either dissolving or wiping during the swish. The hard part of this is that the swishing speed in both scenes has to match, and each scene has to have enough detail that the motion blur creates a good smear. With a long enough lens, this can be a dramatic way to get from one scene to another. An idea that works very well for swish cuts, and for swishes in general, is to have the character trigger it. As the blue man suddenly turns his head, we swish to the other scene. A handoff, also called a transfer, is changing who or what we're following during a shot. We've already been using handoffs a few times without mention. In a scene from a previous chapter, when the red man walks out of the shot, we hand off to the blue man. In this chapter, we'll be looking at panning handoffs and then return to them as they relate to Dolly and Crane. There are basically 4 types of handoff: the end-on, the pickup, the switch, and the step-in. Looking first at the end-on handoff, we follow the characters as they walk past us. We pan with them, doing a handoff to a for sale sign. In this scene, we have 2 characters and we're following the man. As he walks out, we hand off to the woman. Here we're panning with a waiter walking by, then hand off to the characters seated by their table. In all of these moves, there's a sudden shift of attention from one character to another, or between a character and an object. Handoffs immediately give a feeling of purpose to the blocking and get us elegantly from one character to another, whether or not they're a part of the story. In the last example we looked at, we're using a waiter to get into the scene and then hand off to the main characters. The pickup works the opposite way. We're parked on the for sale sign. As the characters walk by, we pick up, handing off the shot and following them instead. Here we're parked on the woman. We then hand off to the man as he walks in and takes over the shot. If we're parked on the characters having dinner, we suddenly pick up on the waiter as he walks by, and then again hand off to some other characters in the restaurant. The switch is between 2 moving characters. If someone is handing someone else a document, he might walk in. We switch to her and she walks. We'll then end on the blue man as she slaps the documents into his hands. Finally, the step-in, as the name implies, is a type of handoff that occurs when a character steps into the shot. As she steps forwards, we help with the move, in effect handing off the shot to her. So to look at some practical uses for the handoff, we'll start with using them for getting reaction shots. Here we'll use the man's close-up to pan with him as he leaves the scene, handing off to the woman for reaction. We can do this almost any time a character leaves a scene. In a sense, a handoff is always a transition, so we can use it as a unique way to glue together lines of dialogue. Here the man is talking. The woman has a few lines. And the man again takes over the dialogue as well as the shot. A switch is very effective for replacing a character. We're having dialogue here. As the man walks out, we use one of the reverses to pan. We switch the shot to another character who enters, pan back into the reverse shot, and we've successfully replaced a character. We start in one of the reverses. The man walks out. The switch occurs here, and we pan back into an over the shoulder, revealing the woman having replaced the character. The beauty is that we can reuse both cameras for the second dialogue. If the men need to have dialogue during the switch, we instead stop for a moment, then continue doing a slow handoff. In order to ingrain this move, let's do an unrealistic sequence where we try to do as many handoffs as possible. First, the blue woman walks past the red man and we do a handoff to him. Then he walks past the blue man and we hand off to him. The blue man walks over to the others, which is just a reveal. Then the woman leaves the frame and we hand off to the 2 men. We do a step-in as she re-enters the frame. We give the shot to her as she leaves, then switch to the red woman who enters, and walks over to the others where we do a simple end-on. The red man walks out of the frame and we hand off to the woman. We pick up on the blue man as he walks over to the red man. We pick up on the blue woman as she re-enters the scene, then switch to the red woman as she walks over to the others. Again, we pick up on the blue woman as she walks over here. As she leaves, we simply shift over and end on the others. As we now begin to look at tracking shots, let's first look at getting the maximum impact from a move. Parallax is the apparent change in position of objects and characters in the scene as we change perspective. As we track left and right, the characters that are closer to the camera seem to change position faster, and the characters that are further away seem to move slower. This is crucial to be aware of, because the impact we get from a dolly or a crane move depends almost entirely on the amount of parallax we experience. If we don't have any parallax, we defeat the purpose of being on a track or on a crane. Let's do 4 identical camera moves where the only difference is the amount of parallax. For the first version, the character walks from left to right with no other objects in the scene. Without any other objects, we almost don't know we're moving. By putting some trees in the scene, we're starting to notice a little bit of perspective change. Moving the trees closer, the same move we've already done twice now feels a lot faster. So let's put the trees right in front of the camera. A move that previously seemed too slow suddenly seems very fast, although we're moving at exactly the same speed. This is because the speed we perceive depends almost entirely on the proximity of foreground objects. Looking at crane shots, we experience vertical parallax. If we start by craning down on a character who arrives in an empty scene, we have a slight feeling of movement. If we put in a tree at a distance, we increase our perception of speed. Moving the tree closer, we again increase the perceived speed. And if we put the tree right in front of the camera, the move seems much faster, although we're going at exactly the same speed. So it's clear that when we're doing any kind of move, we either have to find some foreground to move behind or put something in there. Let's look at depth parallax as we move in and out of a scene. In the first version, we have no objects in the scene, so we hardly know we're moving, and it almost feels like a zoom. In the next version, we put some trees in the left and right of the scene, and we already get some sense of movement. In the last version, we've put the trees close to the center, and our perceived speed is vastly increased. Even without foreground objects, we can increase our perceived speed by changing our height. Tracking with a character at eye level, as expected, we get almost no sense of movement. But if we lower the camera, the floor pattern is closer to us, and we get an increased sense of movement. In this practical example, the red man will walk from the blue man to the woman. As we watch the move, we don't get much feeling of being on a track. So let's place a tree and some columns in the foreground. The move is now much more dynamic. But we don't have to have constant foreground to get a sense of movement. Let's place just one column in the middle of the move. Halfway through the move, the column reminds us of our speed, so even just occasional foreground is enough to get a sense of movement. It's worth noting that even for a pan shot, we can create a sort of pseudo-parallax simply by having foreground in the shot. It's not actually parallax because there's no perspective change, but it still creates the feeling of passing foreground and makes the panning action much more visible. So let's look at some ways to coordinate foreground. The two basic approaches are to either build the blocking around foreground already on the set, or to simply rearrange the set by either moving or adding props, or by rearranging the characters and using extras. In order to use the foreground that's already there, all we have to do is find something to put the camera behind. Here we track with the man as he walks to the woman. We get almost no parallax, which makes the move less than it could be. If we simply decide to place the track further back, we get the fence in the foreground. We now get much more parallax. If we have the characters walking in a park, we might stay slightly ahead of them. Again, we almost don't know we're moving except by watching the trees in the background. So let's move the whole arrangement over here. We're doing the exact same move, but because of the foreground, we get more apparent movement. To cover some characters walking down the street, we'll place the track behind a fence. We can easily see the characters through the fence. The fence stops, then there's a tree, an extra, and then another fence. Gaps in the foreground keep the scene interesting, but don't steal our attention. The other method is to simply bring in objects for foreground. Looking first at using props, we'll start with an empty shot of the characters walking to a different part of the room. But let's create some parallax by moving in some objects that could easily be in the room. Often, the audience doesn't know the exact layout of the room, so we can simply bring in objects that fit with the rest of the set design. Plants are a very unintrusive way of getting foreground because we can see through them. Here we're craning down on a character, but without foreground, such a move has very little effect. If we simply stick some branches in from the side, everyone will assume that there's a tree to the left of us. When we crane down now, it's a very pleasant move. A way of using foreground that's often overlooked is to use extras the same way we would use branches or props. Here we're at a party and the woman walks from the red man to the blue man. If we wanted to create some foreground, we could put in a lamp or a buffet. But let's instead rearrange some extras in the scene so that we're sure to pass behind some of them during the travel. In addition to making the move more effective, it causes the characters to blend much better into the scene. As soon as we take liberty to rearrange the set, we get much more control over the shot. Another way to use props or extras is as arbitrary foreground. If we move these two extras into the shot, the man on the right will be visible in the ending keyframe. When we track as before, we go behind the first couple of extras, then pass behind the next pair. As we end, the male extra is still visible, which creates depth and gives the surrounding scene a life of its own. Anything we place in the foreground to get more parallax could be labeled arbitrary foreground, but our specific goal here is to place foreground objects in keyframes. In addition to creating depth, it gives us parallax at the beginning and end of the move. We don't need constant foreground to get a sense of speed. Even just objects at the beginning and end can be enough. The opposite of arbitrary foreground is to coordinate foreground meaningful to the story. Here, all the computer screens are flashing red. As we track with the red man, one of the screens passes through the shot. This gives an elegant depth because the screen provides relevant information about the situation. Another way to coordinate meaningful foreground is to time it so that a character's line fits with our tracking past him. Here we're connecting 3 script lines into one shot. The red man talks to the blue man replies, and the red man talks to the woman. Our last topic in this chapter is partially obscured moves. In this scene, the man walks over to the woman. Since we're on the other side of the wall, the man is obscured in the entire middle part of the shot. As we track with him, he's quickly obscured, and we instead look at the interior decoration. It's an interesting way to shoot it, and it's amazing how long we can block out the character without losing track of him. Let's create a situation where we track with the character as he walks through a pile of debris. He disappears behind the debris. We get a couple of glimpses here and there. He becomes completely obscured. And finally, we stop with some debris coming in around the edges. Finally, let's combine these last techniques. In this scene, the woman hears the man outside and walks to the door. So in the first keyframe, we'll put in a bird as arbitrary foreground. She walks, and the middle part of the move is obscured by both the tree and the walls of the hut. In the second keyframe, we've placed some pottery as arbitrary foreground. We start on her inside the house. The bird has no story function, we're just using it to create depth and to help the parallax in the beginning. She then walks to the door. The foreground almost completely obscures her. At the end, she's in the clear, and we've used the pottery in the foreground as part of the framing. The reason tracking from keyframe to keyframe makes blocking so easy is that all we have to do is pick the keyframes we know we want to be in and then simply connect them with a track. In a previous shot, we selected these two keyframes and then connected them. This creates a camera that's basically welded into the scene and is useful long before and after the actual move. Before and after the move, the camera functions as a lock shot, framed well enough that it could work on its own. But the beauty of this approach is that on a much larger scale, we can block an entire scene as maybe 5 or 10 keyframes and then later decide which keyframes we want to connect and how. This is an extremely powerful and productive blocking method. In this scene, we'll again start with the man here, so we'll put in 2 keyframes as over the shoulders, which we'll draw as lock cameras, although for now they're just meant as placeholders. The man again walks over here, and we'll place another keyframe as an over-the-shoulder 3-shot. To get more coverage here, we'll add a keyframe for a reverse 3-shot. At some point, the blue woman walks to the red woman, and for this dialogue, we'll again add 2 over-the-shoulders, which, like the other cameras, are placeholders. The key now is that we can connect these keyframes many different ways. If we connect these keyframes into a track, we have essentially the same move as before. We could also connect these keyframes, in which case we would be tracking with a man, but ending in the reverse 3-shot, which are so close they could be connected with a pan. For the part where the blue woman walks to the red woman, we could start in this keyframe and track to this keyframe. But joining these keyframes on a track would preclude this connection unless we had very bent track or a crab dolly which can change direction. Another option for tracking with a woman is to join these keyframes, in which case we would be pulling from one over the shoulder to another. So let's choose which keyframes to join. The move between these keyframes seemed to work as we saw in the beginning, so let's remove the keyframes and put in a track instead. To track with a blue woman for her walk, we'll connect these keyframes, so we'll again replace them with a track set up to go between them. The remaining keyframes are now no longer placeholders, and we'll leave them as lock cameras. So starting in this lock camera, we cut to the keyframe on a track, and pull with the red man over to the other dialogue. Here we can cut to the reverse 3-shot, which is locked on a track. Back in the previous camera, the woman turns, and we cut again to the reverse, which tracks over to become an over-the-shoulder here. To complete the coverage, we use the remaining keyframe, which is now a lock camera. Another way to integrate tracking cameras into a scene is to use them as a backbone, having them stop in useful places and adding lock cameras to complete the coverage. In this scene, the red man will walk to the woman, ending in this keyframe. He then walks to the blue man, and then walks back again. The first keyframe is complete as it is. But we've deliberately made the second keyframe an over the shoulder, so we can add a reverse that mirrors the tracking camera. In the third keyframe, we're again an over the shoulder, so we'll likewise add a matching reverse. Each of our keyframes are framed at different heights and angles, but as long as the equipment is capable of going between them, we can really frame them any way we want. As we cut to the reverses, the coverage becomes complete and the tracking camera is seamlessly integrated. It usually makes sense to shoot the backbone camera first, so we know which framings we're matching with the reverses. The elegant part of this strategy is that if the character we're following moves between keyframes we've already been to, we can simply reuse both the backbone camera and the matching reverses. A great use of backbone cameras is to have one track be the backbone for part of a scene, and then let another backbone track take over for another part of the scene. As before, we'll start the scene with one backbone camera. As we converge into the first keyframe and over the shoulder, we'll add a matching reverse. Then the red man walks over to the blue man, and after a short while we'll begin slowly catching up to get some subtle movement. In this keyframe, we're again half of a reverse pair, so we'll add a matching camera. But let's put it on a track so that when the red man leaves, this camera can become our new backbone for the last half of the scene. We move around to the front of the blue man, finally revealing the woman in the background. She walks closer, and we reframe slightly to maintain a good framing. Here again, we're half of a reverse pair, so we'll add a matching camera for the remaining dialogue. We've essentially daisy-chained two backbone cameras so they take over from each other. On the first track, we arrive in the first keyframe and cut dialogue with a locked reverse. After a while, the red man looks to the blue man, excuses himself, and walks over. We pan first, then catch up with the track, ending in a useful keyframe. Here we cut dialogue between the first and second backbone cameras, which are now both locked. When the red man walks out, we move to get a more personal view of the blue man, finally revealing the woman. As she walks closer, we push a little to maintain the framing. Again, in a useful keyframe, we add a locked reverse to cover the remaining dialogue. We would now add more cameras to get more detailed coverage, but the two backbone cameras provide a solid structure that's easy to build upon. The last thing we'll look at in this chapter is who we're staying on during a move. Very often, keyframes are angled enough that we can only frame one character during the move. We get very different results depending on who we choose. Here we're staying on the man. This causes the woman to disappear for a moment, then to be revealed again at the end. Here we're staying on the woman. The key is to stay on the person whose emotions we're most interested in at the point in the scene, which is sometimes the listening character. As the man walks back, he's driving the scene, so we'll stay on him. One thing that helps break the perception that we're seeing the whole scene from the same side is deliberately placing keyframes on opposite sides of the line. In a scene from the previous chapter, the beginning and ending keyframes of the man's walk are on opposite sides. Placing keyframes on opposite sides of the line first of all makes the scene more complex. Here our tracking camera is a master, and we'll add two reverses for dialogue. As the woman walks and talks, we go to a keyframe that causes a line cross, and add a reverse to fill in. First, we're cutting between the two reverses. Out in the master, she walks to the second keyframe. By crossing the line, we break the perception that we're stuck on one side of the line, and the scene feels freer to move where it wants. But on a very practical level, it also means that we can really place keyframes without any particular care about which side of the line we're on, as long as we put in matching reverses on the same side. Another consequence of this is that we get more parallax. Here we'll be crossing the line on our way into the scene. We could just end the move here, in which case the woman would be revealed at the very end of the move. But crossing the line on the way in, she not only gets to be in the frame longer, she also becomes a foreground object that gives us more parallax. Having keyframes on opposite sides of the line causes everything to move more, which is great for scenes that need sudden action. If we have the characters placed like this, and the man suddenly has a pain in his stomach, for the effect, let's have him bend down over here. As he moves, the line crosses us while we cross it, and we end in the next keyframe. We start in dialogue, cutting back and forth. Suddenly, the man is in pain. We go to the second keyframe. Here, we continue the dialogue. When the man is feeling better, we reuse the track for the walk back. One of the most powerful uses for going from keyframe to keyframe is to go from one deep staging shot to another. In this scene, we'll do a very simple story. The man in the suit, a commander of a control tower, hurries into the control room. over to the operator, the blue man. He gives an order and then leaves. The woman in the background, a sub-commander, looks worried, then walks over to the operator and talks to him. In the beginning, the commander enters through an elevator door, so here we have an excellent opportunity to prepare a framing that's ready for what's coming up. When the commander steps into the room, the shot is ready for him. When he's arrived by the operator, we'll create a low-angle keyframe that includes them both. When he leaves, we'll create another deep staging keyframe with the woman in the background looking worried. When the woman walks over, she ends up standing where the commander stood before. Going between deep staging keyframes gives a feeling of incredibly tight blocking. We're ready for the commander as he walks into the room, then converge into the next keyframe. After their exchange, the commander leaves. We go into the next deep staging keyframe, conveniently revealing the woman in the background. When she walks over, we go to the final keyframe, essentially the same as before. At any given keyframe, the question we should ask is whether or not we could frame the shot differently to include more characters. In this scene, the dialogue is currently between the two men and the blue woman. The red woman was part of the scene earlier and will be again. At this moment in the scene, we're pulling with the red man from one dialogue to another. This could work fine, but let's find a way to keep the red woman in the scene. Instead of modifying the camera to find a framing that includes her, let's redo the blocking by placing her here. When we pull now, we're still going from one dialogue to another, but it seems as if we just happen upon a good framing here. Then to bring her back into the dialogue, all she has to do is turn. But moving the red woman to fit with this shot has consequences for other cameras in the scene. Since we've now changed her position, we need to go back and adjust any cameras that have been affected. For this reason, it makes sense to start with the most sophisticated camera and then adjust all other cameras and positions accordingly. So far, we've mostly been timing keyframe to keyframe moves directly to the action. As the man walks to the woman, we arrive in the second keyframe at the same time as him. But if we change the timing of the move in relation to the characters so that we first pan with the man as he moves over to the woman, and then slowly catch up, he arrives in the second keyframe long before us. We first pan, then move. The end result is a slow push into the second keyframe. Since pan and dolly are completely independent moves, we're simply offsetting one of the parameters. This creates very fluid blocking where our fixes are less obvious. When we arrive early or late into keyframes, we begin to create some complex moves that from our perspective are easy to execute. This first of all eliminates the start-stop feel we sometimes get from timing moves directly to the action. But more importantly, we often want to do slow pushes towards characters because of the heightened focus it gives to the scene. Arriving late gives us both a reason and a method to do that. We might even want to completely separate the character and pan move from the dolly move. Here we're panning with the man, and he arrives in the second keyframe. But it's not until an important point in the dialogue that we start pushing. By arriving late, we're also stretching out the move, which allows us to get very long and useful coverage. Here we again have two keyframes, one where the blue man has entered the scene, and one where he's walked over to the red man. Instead of timing the move to the blue man's walk, we just let him walk, and then cover the dialogue in one long, slow track, which brings another level of focus to the entire scene. We could just do such a move as a separate element, but then we wouldn't end in a keyframe. Ready for reverse dialogue. Arriving early into a keyframe has a very different effect. In this scene, we again have a keyframe at the beginning and one at the end where the blue man has walked to the red man. We start in the 3-shot. As we push towards the second keyframe, our attention is drawn to the red man. We've already started framing for the second keyframe, even though we're missing one character. As he steps in, he completes the frame. In this idea, the two men are having dialogue in and over the shoulder. We have two keyframes, this one and this one. But let's have the blue man take a long walk. We start our move towards the second keyframe immediately. Meanwhile, the blue man is off camera. We arrive, but the frame is half empty until the blue man steps in and completes it. Seen from the camera's perspective, our attention is drawn towards the red man. As we push in, we're already framing for the ending keyframe. When the blue man steps in, the frame is in perfect balance. In this last example, we're tracking on time with one of the characters, but ahead of the other. In the scene, the woman is breaking up with a man and is packing her belongings. Meanwhile, the man is trying to talk her out of leaving and continuously trails her movement. As we go back and forth between keyframes, we framed each stop with space for the man, after which he steps in to complete the framing. It would be very easy to cover an entire scene with just this camera. With a parallel track, we lay the track horizontal to the scene. Here we're tracking behind a group of people witnessing an important event. This mostly has the function of adding movement to a scene that could just as well have been a lock shot. An effective way to use a parallel track for blocking purposes is to lock onto a character and match his position wherever he moves. In this scene from coordinating foreground, we're matching the man's horizontal position regardless of what foreground passes through the shot. In this scene, we're tracking with characters entering a building. We're staying ahead of them at a constant rate, so even though we're angled, it's still a parallel track. This is basic in and of itself, but we can create some interesting moves by locking onto a character and following him in parallel as he moves back and forth. Here we're locking onto the man as he's addressing a row of cadets. Finally stopping for dialogue. As he turns his attention to the other cadet, we reframe by tracking a little to the left. As he walks again, we keep matching his position. The beauty of the move is that we can get a lot of coverage from one camera that's extremely easy to both plan and shoot. The opposite way of shooting this move is to place the track behind the cadets. Because the cadets have now become foreground objects, we get enormous parallax by tracking behind them, and we're also seeing the scene from their perspective. When he turns his attention, we track to reframe, placing him in the left side instead. The move is visually interesting, and it's easy to get a good framing wherever he stops. A variation of this is to angle the shot and stay slightly ahead of the red man. The perspective of the cadets gives depth to the frame. Again, the placement of the cadets as foreground objects provides almost all the movement in the frame. And at any stop, it's easy to get a good framing. The interesting thing about tracking in parallel is that it's only the horizontal position that matters. As we match his horizontal position, the fact that he also moves closer doesn't change the move. As he moves back, it's the right-left movement that causes us to track with him, not the in-out movement. This is a convenient way to cover spacious scenes. Here the man will walk from the car, over to a mailbox, and then diagonally over to an entrance. Moving from the car to the mailbox, we only track a little bit because the horizontal difference is very small. When he begins walking to the entrance, we're matching his speed. As he moves into the scene, the horizontal movement slows down, and so do we. Finally, tracking in parallel works extremely well shooting through heavy foreground. As we track through the first half of the scene, we're completely matching their speed. We keep hearing their dialogue even as we track behind heavy foreground. This brings a depth to the scene and envelops the characters in a real environment. Since we're matching their horizontal position, we slow down at the end as they walk towards us. Starting on, revealing, and ending on with track follows the same logic of moving from open framings towards closed ones using panning or just editing. When we did this with panning, we would tilt up on the character to reveal. But the most elegant way of doing this is with a track. Starting on his hands tapping nervously, we pull out to reveal him. We could achieve the same effect with panning or editing, but tracking is just a little bit nicer. In another move similar to panning, we track with a blue man as he enters the scene, revealing the sign in the crowd. But revealing with track is far more flexible than revealing with a pan. Here we pull out from the sign, revealing the crowd gathered around it, which we couldn't have done with a pan. In this variation, we're additionally pulling out to a different angle, which not only reveals the scene, it gives us parallax from the characters passing through the shot. Here we pull out from the man to reveal the situation, which we also couldn't have done with a pan. Revealing with track has a number of other uses, which we'll look at now. The first is tracking out from behind something. Here we start the scene by tracking out from behind some trees. As we listen to the characters having a discussion off camera, we track into a doorway. Tracking out from behind something makes the scene just a little more interesting than if we started directly on the characters. Here we're starting on some extras going about their business. While hearing the main characters off camera, we slowly track over to reveal them. The next thing this type of tracking is useful for is revealing individual characters. Here the man talks to an off-camera character. It's not until he turns and walks over that we know who he's talking to. Even if there's no character movement, a useful variation is to start on one of the characters and then pull out, revealing the other. Tracking is extremely effective for a surprise reveal of another character. Here we're tracking with the red woman as she enters her apartment. At the end of the track, we suddenly reveal a character waiting for her. The fact that he's closer to the camera makes that plane slide faster and reveal him more suddenly than if he were deeper into the scene. In this scene, we track across objects lying scattered on the forest floor. Suddenly revealing a man stepping in. This leads us to a concept we'll call a long opening. In this scene, the blue woman has a line, and we slowly track towards two other characters having a conversation off camera. With a long opening, we give a great deal of patience to slowly tracking towards our ultimate goal. From above, it looks obvious, but from within the scene, we don't know where we're supposed to end up, so we not only keep the visual mystery, we seem to arrive in a good ending keyframe by chance. Here we're again starting off camera as we listen to the blue woman talk. Very slowly, we pull into the dialogue. Even as we reveal her, we still don't know who she's talking to, until the reveal is complete. These moves are worth remembering because they can give us 20 to 30 seconds of interesting footage at the beginning of the scene. As we pull back, we reveal the characters seated around a table. We would then go to normal coverage, but by now we've already covered a good part of the scene, so the lock coverage will seem less static. Looking at the last move, the track allows us to start between the characters and then pull out to reveal them. Moves such as these never get boring, and we could in fact slow them down even more. Starting a scene away from the main action is a useful blocking choice. In this scene, all the script calls for is dialogue by the table, so we'll add a reverse pair. But let's make up some stage business of the red man preparing 2 drinks by the counter and then walking over. We'll put the camera on a track, start here, and then walk him into the dialogue. ending in an over-the-shoulder. From within this scene, we then start on the red man having dialogue with an off-camera character, which creates an openness to the shot that makes us want to know what's outside of it. Motivated by a new line of dialogue, the red man walks over. And this is the first time we see the blue man. Additionally, the camera is now an over-the-shoulder, which stays useful for the rest of the scene. One last use for a tracking reveal we'll look at here is restarting a scene halfway through. Here we've been cutting between two reverses, one of which we've put on a track. In the middle of the scene, some important information comes up on the computer screen, so we shoot a pickup where we start on the monitor and pull back into the over-the-shoulder. We then cut back and forth between the characters as they have their conversation. At some point, we cut to the pickup as the information appears, then pull out into the over-the-shoulder, re-revealing the scene. And then continuing the dialogue between the reverses, one of which is the tracking camera.